People talk about breaking glass ceilings, but what happens when the room itself was never built for you? Kendra Williams walks into an exclusive summit where she's immediately made to feel invisible, until a single moment forces everyone to see her. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments if you've ever felt like you didn't belong somewhere, only to prove everyone wrong. The moment Kendra stepped into the grand ballroom of the Linton Executive Summit, she felt it. That lingering pause in conversations, the subtle yet unmistakable glances, the unspoken question hovering in the air. What is she doing here? Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor, each step measured and deliberate. But inside, her heart pounded with a mix of irritation and exhaustion. She had worked twice as hard, fought 3 times as long, and sacrificed more than most of the men in that room just to exist in this space. And still they looked at her as if she had gotten lost. A man in a navy blue suit glanced at her name tag before giving her a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The vendors are setting up on the lower level," he said, his tone polite but dismissive. Kendra's jaw tightened. She had been mistaken for the event staff before. The assistant, the +1, never the keynote. She exhaled slowly and adjusted the lanyard around her neck, making sure the bold letters spelling Dr. Kendra Williams, Ph.D., Global Strategy Consultant, were visible. "I'm not a vendor," she said, her voice controlled, her smile unwavering. "But thanks for the information." The man blinked, clearly caught off guard. Before he could respond, a sharp, confident voice cut through the tension. "Kendra Williams?" She turned to see a woman approaching, mid-50s, power suit, and a presence that commanded attention. Evelyn Whitmore, the event chairwoman. Kendra had spoken to her twice over email but had never met her in person. "Yes," Kendra said, offering her hand. Evelyn shook it firmly, but there was something assessing in her gaze, something uncertain. "You're early." It wasn't a greeting, it was a statement. "Yes," Kendra replied. "I like to get a feel for the room before I speak." Evelyn gave a clipped nod. "Of course. Follow me." Kendra could still feel the eyes on her as she walked behind Evelyn, past clusters of executives laughing over morning coffee, past men who didn't bother hiding their surprise at seeing a black woman stride confidently through the space. Ellen led her into a private lounge where 2 men were seated on leather chairs. One of them, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, barely looked up from his phone. The other, a younger executive with sharp features and an expensive watch, offered a thin smile. "This is Dr. Williams," Evelyn announced. The older man finally glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Ah, the DEI speaker." Kendra felt her fingers clench around the strap of her bag. She wasn't here to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. She was here to speak about global business strategy, the same way she had for Fortune 500 companies, world leaders, and top executives across industries. But she knew how this went. People saw her and assumed she had been invited to discuss race, not power. Evelyn shifted, sensing the tension. "Dr. Williams is our keynote speaker," she clarified. Silence. The younger executive's smile faltered. He clearly hadn't expected that. "Well," the older man finally said, setting his phone aside, "I suppose that'll be different." Kendra kept her expression neutral. Different, not valuable, not necessary, just different. Evelyn checked her watch. "You'll have a few minutes to settle in. I suggest you go over your speech with our AV team." "I'm prepared," Kendra said smoothly. "I just need to know where I'll be waiting before I go on." Evelyn hesitated before gesturing toward the side door. "There's a green room behind the main stage." "Thank you." Kendra turned, her back straight, her stride even. She wouldn't let them see the frustration simmering under her skin. She had expected resistance. She had expected doubt. But what she hadn't expected was what would happen once she took the stage. Because when she grabbed the mic, the entire room would be forced to see exactly who she was. The stage lights burned hot against Kendra's skin, but the cold stares from the audience cut deeper. A sea of executives, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders filled the expansive ballroom, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and something she knew all too well: belief. She had seen it before. Seated in the front row, Evelyn Whitmore sat with her legs crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. To her left, the older executive who had dismissed her earlier leaned back in his chair, arms folded, waiting for her to fumble, waiting for her to confirm whatever bias had already settled in his mind. Kendra adjusted the microphone clipped to her blazer and took a slow breath, her fingers skimming the edge of the podium. She could hear the faint murmurs in the crowd, someone clearing their throat, someone shifting in their chair. The weight of the moment sat heavy in her chest, but she had carried heavier. The screen behind her displayed the title of her keynote, Scaling Beyond Borders, the Global Future of Leadership. Not diversity, not inclusion, not how to fix their corporate blind spots. Business. She met the eyes of a man near the back who had been scrolling through his phone, barely looking up since she stepped onto the stage. His disinterest was deliberate. Kendra had long stopped trying to prove her presence to men like him. Instead, she spoke. "Good morning," she said, letting the words settle. A few mumbled responses followed, but the room remained stiff. She didn't let it shake her. "I want to start by asking a simple question. How many of you here believe you're at the peak of your leadership?" A few hands rose, hesitantly at first, then more followed. Mostly men. She let the silence stretch. "Interesting," she said, nodding. "And how many of you believe your company is fully prepared for the next decade of global business shifts?" This time, fewer hands. Some execs glanced around the room, unsure whether to commit. Kendra allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "I ask these questions because leadership is often mistaken for an endpoint," she continued. "Many people assume that once they've reached a certain level, once they've secured their title, their compensation, their seat at the table, that the learning stops, that the growing stops, that they've arrived." She stepped away from the podium, walking the length of the stage. "But what if I told you that the most dangerous place you could be as a leader is comfortable?" A few heads lifted. "What if I told you that the strategies that got you to this point will not be the ones that keep you here?" Kendra paused, scanning the faces in the audience. Some looked thoughtful, some looked defensive. And then there were the ones still resisting, arms crossed, expressions unreadable, waiting for her to validate their initial assumptions. She refused to give them that satisfaction. In the next 5 years, the fastest-growing markets will not be where you expect them to be. The leaders who will redefine the industry will not come from the traditional pipelines you've grown accustomed to, and the companies that thrive will be the ones that recognize this shift before it happens, not after. She walked back to the podium and clicked a button on the remote in her hand. A graph appeared on the screen behind her. "This," she said, pointing, "is a breakdown of emerging markets projected to surpass North America in technological investment by 2030. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. She clicked again. "And this," she continued, "is what happens when companies fail to adapt. These are the names of organizations that just 10 years ago were industry giants, now irrelevant. And in nearly every case, the failure wasn't due to lack of funding, resources, or talent. It was due to leadership failing to recognize the moment before it passed them by." She let that sink in. "This is not a talk about business as usual," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This is a talk about who gets left behind when leaders refuse to evolve." Silence. And then finally, she saw it. A shift. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough. Enough to know that they were listening. Kendra inhaled, steadying herself. She wasn't here for validation. She wasn't here for approval. She was here to remind them why she belonged in this room. Kendra could feel the shift before the audience even realized it. The rigid posture of the executives in the front row had loosened just slightly. The side conversations that had rippled through the crowd in the beginning had quieted. The man who had been scrolling through his phone was now sitting up, eyes locked on the screen behind her. She had seen it happen before, resistance crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. But there were still some holdouts. The older executive in the front row hadn't moved, arms still folded, expression unreadable. His presence carried an air of silent authority, and she could tell the others took their cues from him. If he refused to engage, others would too. She smiled inwardly. She had dealt with men like him before. Kendra took a breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make people uncomfortable before she spoke again. "Adaptation isn't optional," she said, her voice steady. "It's the difference between companies that thrive and companies that collapse under their own weight, and yet, time and time again, leadership remains the greatest obstacle to innovation." A man in the second row shifted, clearing his throat. She turned toward him, making direct eye contact. "We like to think of leadership as a title," she continued, "a privilege, a reward. But let me ask you this. When was the last time your leadership was tested? Not by a quarterly report, not by a market shift, but by something that truly challenged your perspective." She paused, watching them sit with the question. Because if your answer is never, then you are not leading, you are maintaining. The murmurs started again, this time hushed but present. Kendra turned back to the screen and clicked to the next slide. A list of companies appeared, some instantly recognizable, some lesser known. These organizations all had one thing in common, she said. They led their industries, until they didn't. The older executive raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "What's your point?" The interruption was deliberate. A test. Kendra met his gaze without hesitation. "My point," she said, "is that every leader in this room is making a choice, right now, whether you realize it or not. You are choosing whether you want to be reactive or proactive, whether you want to build the future or be left behind by it." She clicked to the next slide. A photo of a well-known CEO filled the screen. "This man," she said, "once dismissed a young woman in his company who suggested a shift toward digital integration. He believed it was unnecessary, that their traditional methods would continue to serve them well. A decade later, his company filed for bankruptcy. That woman? She now leads an organization valued at over $15 billion. She let the weight of that linger. "The greatest threat to your success," she said, "is assuming that the room you've built will always look the same, that the voices you've always listened to will always be the ones that matter." She scanned the room, taking in the faces now fully engaged. "The moment you dismiss someone who doesn't fit your expectation of leadership," she continued, "you are revealing more about your own limitations than theirs." A sharp inhale, a flicker of recognition in some eyes. She let her next words fall with precision. "And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe it should?" Silence. A slow, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The older executive leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. But he wasn't dismissing her anymore. He was considering. And that was enough. The weight of her words had settled over the room like a thick fog. No one was scrolling through emails now. No one was whispering to the person beside them. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged, humming with the energy of shifting perspectives and uncomfortable realizations. Kendra had spent years mastering this moment, the fine edge of tension where people either leaned in or doubled down. She could see it happening now. Some executives sat with arms still crossed, their postures rigid, resisting the inevitable. Others, though, the ones who understood what she was really saying, looked different. Their eyes weren't just on her, they were absorbing, recalculating, questioning themselves in real time. She exhaled. "This is where the work begins," she said, her voice steady, "because leadership isn't just about power, it's about responsibility, and the most dangerous thing any of us can do is assume we've already figured it out." She let that sit for a beat before clicking to the next slide. Let's talk about solutions. A new set of figures appeared on the screen. These are companies that survived disruption because they chose to change before they had to, she continued. The ones that didn't wait until their market share was slipping or their profits were tanking. The ones that saw where the world was going and adjusted accordingly. Her eyes moved across the room. I've spent my career advising leaders at the highest level. The biggest mistake I see, she paused, making sure she had them. They mistake survival for success. They assume because they're still here, they're still winning. A small murmur rippled through the crowd. She saw a few executives nod, reluctant but unable to deny the truth in her words. She clicked again. The slide changed. These companies, she said, pointing to a list of recognizable names. They thought they were untouchable. They thought their industry would never change, and now they're a cautionary tale. She let the list linger on the screen before clicking one last time. And these, she said as a new list appeared, are the leaders shaping the future. The ones who decided that innovation wasn't an option. It was a requirement. The tension in the room had shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't about proving she deserved to be there. She had already done that. Now, they were focused on themselves, on the implications of everything she had just laid out. She stepped away from the podium, letting her hands rest at her sides. Here's my challenge to you, she said. Ask yourself right now what kind of leader you want to be. Are you going to hold on to the way things have always been simply because it feels safe? Or are you going to evolve before the world forces your hand? A few people were scribbling notes now. Others sat still, their jaws tight, eyes forward, as if they were afraid to move. I'm not here to tell you what to do, she continued. I'm here to tell you what's coming, and whether or not you decide to be part of that change is entirely up to you. She stepped back, letting the silence hold just a second longer before offering one final thought. Just remember, every empire believed it would last forever, until it didn't. And with that, she walked off the stage. No music played. No one immediately stood. The weight of her words had landed exactly where they needed to. Then, slowly, one by one, the applause started. Quiet at first, then louder, then, all at once, a standing ovation. Kendra didn't turn back. She didn't need to. She had already won. He said, based on the uploaded image, create a prompt similar to what's happening in the image. Make their angles and positions exactly the same. Disregard the arrows, circles, and texts. Make an image prompt for Leonardo AI for a YouTube thumbnail. With this prompt, it will generate an image showing strong emotions that would capture the viewer's attention. It should not be just the characters looking at each other. It should look intriguing. It should have a topic. Include these: names, ages, if they are black or white, facial features, hairstyle/haircut, if they have a beard and its color, the clothes they wore and their colors, the setting, don't mention their footwear. All of those should match the sequence of the story. Make the angles good. Never mention dimly lit when it comes to the lighting. Make the image colorful and bright. Make sure the image looks very realistic. Add photorealistic image at the beginning. Make it a paragraph. This is the title. They said, "You don't belong here." Then she grabbed the mic as the keynote. ChatGPT said, I don't have access to the uploaded image, but I can still create a photorealistic and intriguing prompt for Leonardo AI based on the story's climax. Here's the detailed prompt for generating a YouTube thumbnail. Photorealistic image. A high-energy corporate conference setting with a massive LED screen in the background displaying keynote speaker Dr. Kendra Williams. Dr. Kendra Williams, a 38-year-old black woman with sharp cheekbones, expressive dark brown eyes, and full lips, stands center stage, gripping a microphone with undeniable authority. Her sleek, shoulder-length black hair is styled in a straight, side-parted bob. She wears a royal blue power suit with a fitted blazer and matching trousers, exuding confidence. Her face is determined, eyebrows slightly raised, lips parted mid-speech, as if she's delivering a groundbreaking point. In the foreground, slightly out of focus but visible, is Richard Calloway, a 62-year-old white executive with silver hair combed back, a square jaw, piercing blue eyes, and a short, neatly trimmed salt-and-pepper beard. He is wearing a dark gray three-piece suit with a red tie and sits in the front row with his arms crossed, his brows furrowed, lips pressed into a thin line, his expression a mix of disbelief and realization, as if Kendra just shattered his long-held assumptions. To the side, Evelyn Whitmore, a 55-year-old white woman with wavy blonde hair tied into an elegant low bun, is dressed in a beige blazer over a white blouse. Her eyes are wide, mouth slightly open, as if she's witnessing something she hadn't expected. Her hands rest on her lap, one clutching a notepad, frozen mid-mission. The audience in the background consists of men and women in formal attire, some leaning forward with their hands clasped, others exchanging uncertain glances. The lighting is bright and professional, emphasizing Kendra as the focal point, making her look powerful and in command. The camera angle is dramatic, slightly low, making Kendra appear larger than life, while Richard and Evelyn are at a slightly tilted perspective to emphasize their reactions. The contrast between Kendra's confidence and Richard's discomfort makes the scene visually gripping and full of tension, ensuring the image immediately captures the viewer's attention.